Do you believe that pain can transform into a monster? That a wound deep enough can forge something that haunts us forever? The mist rises from Crystal Lake at dawn, carrying with it whispers of a story that has captivated and terrified generations. Today, we're going to explore the real story behind Jason Vorhees, not the cold-blooded killer from the movies, but the symbol of human anguish that he truly represents. And trust me, this truth is far more terrifying than anything Hollywood has ever created. But before we begin, I need to warn you about something. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a fictional character. It's about the monsters we create when we turn away from pain, when we abandon those who need us most, and when we allow our wounds to fester in darkness until they become something unrecognizable. This is a story about transformation, not just of flesh and bone, but of the human soul itself. Every culture has its boogeyman, its cautionary tale whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. Jason Vorhees has become America's modern mythology, a figure so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that his presence extends far beyond the silver screen. But what if I told you that the real Jason, the one that exists in the shadows between fact and fiction, is more complex, more human, and infinitely more tragic than any movie could capture? The hockey mask has become an icon of terror, but few people understand what it truly represents. It's not just a disguise worn by a killer. It's a shield, a barrier between the world and a pain so profound that it cannot bear to show its face. When we see that mask, we're not looking at evil incarnate. We're looking at what happens when society fails its most vulnerable members, when a child's cry for help goes unheard until it transforms into something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand the monster, we must first understand the child. To comprehend the legend, we must excavate the truth buried beneath decades of exploitation and sensationalism. What you'll discover might change the way you think about monsters altogether. Because once you see Jason for who he really is, you'll never be able to unsee him. And more importantly, you'll start recognizing pieces of him in places you never expected, in the forgotten corners of your own heart, in the wounds you've left unhealed, in the parts of yourself you've learned to hide behind your own mask. The year was 1957, and beneath a merciless summer sky, Jason Vorhees entered this world. But not as a normal child should enter, with cries of life and possibility stretching endlessly ahead. No, Jason's arrival was marked by silence, by the kind of quiet that echoes louder than any scream. Pamela Voorhees, Jason's mother, faced the worst pain any woman could endure. Her son was born already claimed by death, his small body never drawing that first essential breath that separates the living from the lost. The doctors spoke in hushed, clinical terms about complications, about things beyond anyone's control. But Pamela heard something else in their voices: indifference, the casual dismissal of a life that had barely begun before it ended. But this wasn't nature's fault. This was the consequence of neglect, of a society that turns its back on the vulnerable and the poor. The Camp Crystal Lake Medical Facility was understaffed, under-equipped, and overwhelmed. Pamela had begged for better care during her difficult pregnancy, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. She was just another woman from the wrong side of the tracks, carrying the child whose father had disappeared the moment he learned of the pregnancy. The official records are sparse, deliberately so. Birth certificate: Jason Vorhees, deceased. Cause of death: birth complications due to severe physical deformities and developmental abnormalities. But between those sterile lines lies a story of systematic failure, of a healthcare system that prioritized profit over people, of a community that had already written off certain lives as expendable. Pamela held her son for exactly 17 minutes. She counted every second, memorizing the weight of him, the impossible softness of his skin, the way his tiny fingers seemed to curl around something invisible. In those 17 minutes, she made promises that would echo through the decades to come. She whispered apologies for bringing him into a world that didn't want him, and she swore oaths that would eventually transform her from grieving mother into something much darker. The human mind has remarkable defense mechanisms when confronted with unbearable loss. For some, denial provides temporary shelter. For others, anger becomes a fortress. But for Pamela Voorhees, grief became something else entirely. It became purpose. She couldn't accept what had happened. More than that, she refused to let it be meaningless. Her rage wasn't just directed at fate, but at the entire world that had failed her son before he'd even had a chance to live. The nurses who had rolled their eyes when she asked questions. The doctor who had rushed through his examination because he had paying patients waiting. The social worker who had suggested that maybe it was for the best given Jason's condition. When that rage finally burned itself out, what remained wasn't emptiness. It was something far more dangerous. It was a void large enough to give birth to a legend. But here's where the official story breaks down, where the neat narrative of a grieving mother's descent into madness begins to unravel. Because what Pamela did after Jason's death wasn't just random violence or senseless revenge. It was systematic, purposeful, and carried out with a precision that suggested something beyond mere insanity. She didn't just disappear into grief, she transformed herself into an instrument of it. And in doing so, she ensured that both she and Jason would become part of Crystal Lake forever. The question that has haunted investigators for decades isn't whether Pamela killed those camp counselors in 1979. The evidence is overwhelming that she did. The question is what happened to Jason's body after that 17-minute embrace. Official records show he was buried in Eternal Rest Cemetery, Plot 47B, under a small stone that reads simply Baby Voorhees. But when authorities examined the grave in 1980, following the Crystal Lake murders, they found something that changed everything. The coffin was empty, not dug up empty from the beginning, as if it had never held a body at all. This is where the real story begins. Not with a killer stalking teenagers, but with a mother's love so fierce it refused to accept the finality of death. What happened to Jason in those 17 minutes? What promises did Pamela make that were so binding they could reach across the veil between life and death? The truth, as we're about to discover, is both simpler and more terrifying than any movie franchise could capture. Because the real Jason Vorhees isn't a supernatural slasher, he's something far more human, and therefore far more dangerous. He's what happens when love curdles into obsession, when protection becomes persecution, and when a mother's desperate attempt to save her child creates the very monster she was trying to prevent. The transformation was complete by the summer of 1979, when Camp Crystal Lake reopened for the first time since Jason's death. Pamela had spent 22 years preparing for this moment. 22 years planning her response to what she saw as the world's ultimate act of defiance. Attempting to move on as if Jason had never existed, as if his death didn't matter. She was ready, but she wasn't alone. The Jason Vorhees phenomenon has spawned countless theories, each attempting to explain how a stillborn child became one of America's most enduring symbols of terror. But 3 theories stand above the rest, each offering a different lens through which to understand not just Jason, but the deeper truths about human nature that his story reveals. The first theory suggests that Jason is the physical manifestation of collective trauma centered around Crystal Lake, a psychic phenomenon born from the accumulated anguish of every life lost or damaged in that cursed place. Imagine the pain of a mother losing her child, then multiply it by every person who has died at Crystal Lake over the decades. The accidental drownings, the murders, the suicides of those who couldn't escape the weight of their own guilt. Each death adds to the psychic pressure, like a volcano building toward inevitable eruption. In this interpretation, Jason isn't an individual at all. He's a natural phenomenon of human emotion, a psychic storm given physical form. This would explain his seemingly supernatural abilities, his immunity to conventional weapons, his capacity to appear wherever he's needed most, his agelessness. He doesn't follow the rules of biology because he isn't truly biological. He's pure force, the concentrated essence of vengeance itself. The theory gains credibility when we examine the pattern of his appearances. Jason doesn't kill randomly. There's always a connection to Crystal Lake, always some violation of the sanctity that Pamela tried to create around her son's memory. He manifests when that sacred space is threatened, when people dare to find joy in a place consecrated by suffering. But this raises disturbing questions about the nature of trauma itself. If pain can literally take physical form, if grief can walk among us wearing a hockey mask, then what does that say about the wounds we carry? Every parent who has lost a child, every person who has experienced profound injustice, do they all have the potential to birth their own Jason? Are we all walking around with invisible monsters gestating in our hearts, waiting for the right conditions to emerge? The vengeful spirit theory suggests that Jason is immortal, not because he's supernatural, but because the emotions that created him are themselves eternal. As long as there is injustice, as long as there are children who die before their time, as long as there are mothers who must bury their babies, Jason will endure. He's not just Pamela's monster, he's humanity's monster, the physical manifestation of our collective failure to protect the innocent. This theory also explains why Jason seems to target teenagers and young adults specifically. They represent everything that Jason was denied, the chance to grow up, to make mistakes, to experience love and loss and all the messy complications of human existence. Every laugh around a campfire is a reminder of the joy he'll never know. Every first kiss is a milestone he'll never reach. In this interpretation, Jason's violence isn't random, it's achingly specific, the desperate flailing of a child forever trapped in the moment of his death, raging against a world that continued without him. But what if Jason actually survived that terrible summer day in 1957? What if Pamela's 17 minutes with her son weren't a final goodbye, but the beginning of something else entirely? Humans possess an extraordinary capacity for adaptation, especially in extreme circumstances. History is filled with accounts of children surviving in impossible conditions, developing abilities that seem almost supernatural to those of us who have never faced such trials. The feral child theory suggests that Jason didn't die in that hospital. Instead, Pamela, unable to bear the thought of leaving him in the hands of a system that had already failed him, spirited him away to the wilderness surrounding Crystal Lake. Consider the documented cases. Victor of Aveyron, raised by wolves in 18th century France, who could survive naked in snow and detect scents imperceptible to normal humans. Oksana Malaya of Ukraine, who lived with dogs for her first 6 years and developed canine-like characteristics that persisted into adulthood. The children of the Romanian forests, abandoned during Ceausescu's regime, who learned to hunt with their bare hands and navigate by starlight. A child raised in the wild develops senses that put trained soldiers to shame. Hearing so acute, it can detect a heartbeat from 100 yards away. A sense of smell capable of tracking emotional states through chemical signatures in sweat and breath. Intelligence focused not on abstract concepts, but on the essential skills of survival patience. Stealth, the ability to read body language and predict behavior with uncanny accuracy. In this theory, Jason isn't a monster, he's a forest god, the last embodiment of truly wild humanity in an increasingly domesticated world. His seeming invincibility comes not from supernatural origins, but from a lifetime spent in an environment where a single mistake means death. Every step he takes is silent because he learned to walk on forest floors covered with dry leaves and brittle twigs. Every attack is precisely calculated because he grew up hunting prey that could outrun, outclimb, or outfight him if he made even the smallest error. The hockey mask, in this interpretation, isn't meant to hide supernatural deformity, it's camouflage, protection for a face that has been shaped by decades of harsh living. The slow, deliberate movements that characterize Jason in the films aren't the shuffling of an undead creature, but the careful gait of a predator who has learned that patience is more valuable than speed. This theory also explains Jason's deep connection to Crystal Lake itself. It's not just his hunting ground, it's his home, the place where he learned every tree, every path, every hiding spot. He knows where the morning mist will be thickest, which areas of the lake freeze last in winter, how sound travels differently across the water at night. To Jason, the camp counselors and teenage visitors aren't just intruders, they're ecological disasters, urban humans stumbling through his carefully maintained world with all the subtlety of a marching band. But perhaps most importantly, this theory suggests that Jason's violence stems not from supernatural rage, but from something far more understandable: fear. Imagine a child who has never known human society beyond the first few hours of life, suddenly confronted with groups of strangers invading his sanctuary. Every social cue is alien, every sound and smell associated with the world that rejected him before he could even cry. His attacks aren't motivated by evil. They're the desperate defensive actions of a wild creature protecting his territory and his sanity. The feral child theory transforms Jason from a supernatural slasher into something tragic, a human being so fundamentally shaped by abandonment and isolation that he can no longer recognize his own species as anything other than a threat. But perhaps the truth runs deeper than either supernatural phenomena or survival stories. Perhaps Jason Vorhees exists not as a literal entity, but as a psychological archetype, the embodiment of unhealed trauma that lives within all of us. Every human being carries wounds from their past, experiences of abandonment, rejection, or failure that cut deep enough to leave permanent scars. In most cases, we learn to integrate these experiences, to find meaning in our suffering, or at least to develop coping mechanisms that allow us to function. But sometimes, when the wound is too deep, when the support system is too weak, when the pain is dismissed or ignored for too long, the trauma becomes something else entirely. It becomes our own personal Jason. In this interpretation, Jason represents the part of ourselves that never healed from our earliest injuries. He's the child within us who was told he was unwanted, who was abandoned when he needed protection most, who learned that the world is a dangerous place where love is conditional and survival is always uncertain. This inner Jason doesn't age or mature because trauma exists outside of time. The 40-year-old who was emotionally neglected as a child still carries that wounded 5-year-old inside, still flinches at the same triggers, still reacts to perceived threats with the same fight or flight intensity. The hockey mask becomes a metaphor for the emotional barriers we construct to protect our most vulnerable selves. We all wear masks: the confident professional face we show at work, the caring parent persona we present to our children, the attractive partner image we project in relationships. But beneath these masks lies our authentic self, often scarred and frightened, hidden away because we learned early that showing our true face invites rejection or attack. Jason's seeming invincibility mirrors the way traumatic patterns persist in our lives despite our best efforts to change them. We go to therapy, we read self-help books, we make resolutions and promises to ourselves about breaking destructive cycles. Yet somehow that wounded part of us keeps surfacing, keeps sabotaging our relationships, keeps finding ways to confirm its fundamental belief that we're unworthy of love or belonging. The Crystal Lake setting becomes a metaphor for the family systems or communities where our original wounds were inflicted. These environments may look peaceful on the surface, like a beautiful summer camp where kids should be able to play safely, but underneath lurk the unresolved traumas and toxic dynamics that created our monsters in the first place. When new people enter these systems, the camp counselors, the teenage visitors, they inevitably trigger the dormant trauma, awakening the Jason who has been waiting in the shadows. This theory explains why Jason's story resonates so deeply with audiences who have never experienced anything remotely similar to his fictional circumstances. We respond to him not because we fear a masked killer in the woods, but because we recognize something familiar in his rage, his pain, his desperate need to protect a sacred space from invasion. We've all felt abandoned. We've all been told in ways subtle or obvious that we don't belong. We've all had our cries for help ignored or dismissed. The teenagers in the Jason films represent the parts of ourselves or others that seem to navigate life effortlessly beautiful, confident, sexually active, socially connected. To our inner Jason, these aspects of humanity represent everything we were denied, everything we failed to become because our development was stunted by trauma. The violence in the films isn't just random slashing. It's the rage of the wounded inner child finally given permission to destroy what it could never have. But here's where this theory becomes both hopeful and terrifying. If Jason is a symbol of unhealed trauma, then he can potentially be healed. The monster isn't permanent, isn't supernatural, isn't beyond the reach of human compassion and understanding. But healing requires something that terrifies most of us even more than the monster itself. It requires taking off the mask, acknowledging the wounds, and trusting that showing our true face won't result in abandonment or attack. The most frightening thing about Jason isn't his machete or his strength. It's the possibility that he might be right. That the world really is unsafe for vulnerable children. That people really will reject us if they see our damage. That the mask really is necessary for survival. Healing from trauma requires a leap of faith that defies everything the wounded part of us believes about human nature. And sometimes that leap feels impossible. Sometimes it seems safer to stay behind the mask, to keep the monster fed with small acts of revenge or self-sabotage, to accept that some wounds are too deep to heal. In those moments, we become Jason, not literally, but psychologically. We choose the familiar pain over the uncertain possibility of peace. The question isn't whether Jason Vorhees exists in literal reality. It's why his story has embedded itself so deeply in our collective consciousness that he feels real, even to people who know he's fictional. The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and the society we've created. We don't fear the man in the hockey mask. We fear what he represents: the consequence of abandonment, the price of turning away from suffering, the monster that emerges when pain is left to fester in darkness. Jason embodies our deepest anxieties about what happens when society fails its most vulnerable members, when the social contract breaks down, when the institutions meant to protect us become sources of harm instead. At its core, Jason's story is about the failure of the adult world to protect children. Every parent who has ever sent their child to summer camp understands this fear on a visceral level. We entrust our most precious possessions to strangers, hoping they'll be kept safe, but we know that bad things happen to good kids all the time. Jason represents the nightmare scenario, not just accidental harm, but the systematic neglect that allows preventable tragedies to occur. The fear goes deeper than simple parental anxiety, though. Jason forces us to confront the reality that some wounds are so profound they transform their victims into something unrecognizable. He's the embodiment of our terror that trauma can be irreversible, that some people are broken beyond repair, that love and understanding and professional help might not be enough to heal the deepest damages. We live in a culture that promotes the myth of resilience, the idea that anyone can overcome any obstacle with enough determination and positive thinking. Jason shatters this comfortable delusion. He shows us what happens when resilience fails, when the human spirit doesn't triumph over adversity, but is crushed by it. He's proof that some stories don't have happy endings, that some children don't grow up to become functional adults, that some wounds create monsters instead of survivors. This connects to our broader cultural anxiety about masculinity and violence. Jason represents the dark side of male socialization, the boy who was never taught healthy ways to express emotion, who learned that the world responds to force more readily than vulnerability, who concluded that causing fear is easier than inspiring love. He's the logical extreme of a culture that tells boys to be strong, to never show weakness, to solve their problems through aggression rather than communication. But Jason's appeal isn't limited to commentary on toxic masculinity. He also represents something that transcends gender, the human capacity for vengeance. Deep down, most of us harbor fantasies about punishing those who have wronged us. We imagine elaborate scenarios where our enemies get their comeuppance, where justice is served with a heavy hand, where we finally have the power to make others feel as helpless as they once made us feel. Jason is the embodiment of these dark fantasies. He never forgives, never forgets, never moves on. He's immune to pleas for mercy because mercy was never shown to him. He's the perfect revenge fantasy, unstoppable, implacable, absolutely committed to making his enemies pay for their sins. The fact that his revenge often targets people who weren't directly responsible for his original trauma only makes him more relatable, not less. After all, when we're in pain, we rarely limit our anger to those who directly caused it. But Jason teaches us something else, something far more important than the power of vengeance or the dangers of unhealed trauma. He teaches us the absolute necessity of confronting our pain directly, honestly, and completely. When we bury our trauma, when we ignore our grief, when we avoid confronting the deep wounds that shape our behavior, we don't make them disappear, we just drive them underground, where they grow in darkness and silence until they become something monstrous. Every family secret, every "we don't talk about that," every time we choose comfortable lies over difficult truths, we feed the monster. Jason represents what happens when an entire community conspires to forget an inconvenient truth. His death was covered up, his story buried, his mother's grief dismissed as the ravings of an unstable woman. The town of Crystal Lake wanted to move on, to pretend that the tragedy had never happened, to open their summer camp and create new, happier memories that would override the old, painful ones. But trauma doesn't work that way. It doesn't fade with time or disappear when we stop talking about it. It persists, often growing stronger in the silence, until it finds a way to demand acknowledgement. Jason's return to Crystal Lake isn't supernatural, it's inevitable. As long as his story remains untold, his pain unacknowledged, his death unmourned, he will keep coming back. This pattern repeats itself in families, communities, and entire cultures. The uncle whose alcoholism destroyed family gatherings, but whom everyone pretends was just fun-loving. The company that covered up environmental damage and continues to operate as if nothing happened. The historical atrocities that entire nations agree to forget in the name of moving forward. These buried truths don't stay buried. They return as addiction, as illness, as violence, as systemic dysfunction that persists across generations. Jason teaches us that healing requires the opposite of forgetting. It requires remembering, witnessing, acknowledging the full reality of what happened. It requires saying the names of the dead, honoring the magnitude of the loss, creating space for grief even when that grief is inconvenient or uncomfortable. But acknowledgement alone isn't enough. Jason also teaches us about the difference between justice and vengeance, between healing and revenge. His mother, Pamela, chose vengeance. She decided that the only appropriate response to Jason's death was to ensure that others experienced similar loss. Her grief became a weapon, her love transformed into hate, her protective instincts perverted into predatory ones. Real healing requires a different choice, the choice to break the cycle, to refuse to pass on our pain to innocent others, to find ways of honoring our losses that don't require creating new victims. It's the hardest choice imaginable because it feels like betrayal of our wounds, like minimizing our suffering, like letting those who hurt us off the hook. But the alternative, the Jason path, leads nowhere but destruction. Vengeance never satisfies for long because it doesn't address the underlying wound. only creates new ones. The people Jason kills in his quest for justice had nothing to do with his original trauma. But trauma logic doesn't recognize such distinctions. When we're in pain, everyone becomes a potential target. Every slight becomes evidence of universal malice. Every moment of others' happiness becomes an insult to our suffering. The real lesson of Jason Vorhees isn't about the dangers of summer camps or the importance of swimming lessons. It's about the absolute necessity of creating communities where pain can be acknowledged, where trauma can be witnessed, where the wounded can find healing instead of being driven into the shadows to nurse their grievances alone. In 2012, I made a pilgrimage to the place where the Jason legend began. Not to the movie sets or the tourist attractions, but to the actual Crystal Lake in New Jersey, where the real tragedies occurred that inspired the fictional franchise. The lake was smaller than I'd expected, more ordinary. No ominous fog rolled across its surface. No supernatural chill hung in the air. It looked like what it was, a modest body of water surrounded by woods. The kind of place where suburban families might bring their children for an afternoon of swimming and fishing. But as I walked along the shoreline, I began to notice details that spoke to a different story. Among the ancient trees, I found circles of wildflowers that seemed too perfectly arranged to be natural, as if someone had been dancing among them, or perhaps laying wreaths in memory of the lost. The local wildlife exhibited an unusual behavior pattern, gathering in groups near certain spots along the shore, as if drawn by some invisible presence. And then, on a massive oak tree that must have been growing when the original tragedies occurred, I found something that stopped me cold. Carved into the bark with what looked like a child's knife, weathered but still legible, were 3 simple words: Jason was here. The carving was decades old, judging by how the tree had grown around the letters. It couldn't have been left by movie fans or tourists, because it predated the films by years. Someone had stood in this spot, possibly in 1957 or shortly after, and carved those words into living wood. Someone who knew Jason, who remembered him, who wanted to ensure that his existence left some mark on the world. As I traced the letters with my finger, I realized that this wasn't the signature of a killer. This was the mark of a child who had once laughed at the frogs along the shoreline and collected smooth stones from the shallows. A child who, despite everything that came after, had been loved enough that someone wanted the world to remember he had existed. Standing there in that quiet place, I understood something about the Jason story that all the theories and analyses had missed. Jason wasn't really about supernatural horror or psychological trauma or social commentary, though all of those elements were present. Jason was about the fundamental human need to be remembered, to matter, to leave some evidence that we were here. Every person who dies too young, every child whose potential is cut short, every life that seems to end before it truly began, they all risk the same fate as Jason Vorhees. They risk being forgotten, being reduced to statistics or cautionary tales, having their essential humanity buried beneath the circumstances of their death. The real tragedy of Jason's story isn't that he became a monster, it's that he never got the chance to become anything else. We'll never know what he might have accomplished, what contributions he might have made, what joy he might have brought to the world. All of that possibility died with him in that hospital room, leaving behind only the echo of what could have been. But here's what I learned at Crystal Lake, standing beneath that old oak tree with its memorial carved by an unknown hand. Jason does exist, has always existed, will continue to exist as long as there are children who die before their time and mothers, who love them enough to refuse to let them be forgotten. Maybe he manifests as a literal presence stalking the shores of that small New Jersey lake. Maybe he exists only in the collective unconscious, a shared symbol of loss and regret. Maybe he's simply a story we tell ourselves about the importance of protecting the vulnerable and remembering the lost. It doesn't matter which interpretation is literally true. because they all point to the same essential message. Don't let pain become monster. Face it, heal it, honor it without being consumed by it. The Jason story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we treat the wounded among us. Do we create space for their pain, or do we expect them to suffer in silence? Do we offer genuine support, or do we simply wish they would heal faster so we don't have to feel uncomfortable around their trauma? Do we remember the dead with genuine love, or do we forget them as quickly as decency allows? Every community creates its own Jason, not necessarily a literal killer, but a symbol of its unhealed wounds, its buried traumas, its refusal to acknowledge difficult truths. The specific details vary, but the pattern remains constant. Pain that is ignored, trauma that is dismissed, wounds that are left to fester in darkness until they transform into something monstrous. The antidote isn't complicated, though it's often difficult to implement. It requires creating communities where suffering can be acknowledged without shame, where the wounded can find healing instead of being driven into isolation, where the dead are genuinely mourned rather than quickly forgotten. It requires the courage to face our own monsters, the parts of ourselves that were damaged by early trauma, the ways we've learned to hide our pain behind masks of our own making. Because in the end, what we fear most isn't the monster lurking in the lake or the killer waiting in the woods. What we fear most is the monster that lives within each of us, the capacity for cruelty born from unhealed wounds, the potential for destruction that emerges when love is twisted by loss, the possibility that our own pain might transform us into something we no longer recognize. Jason Vorhees is all of us and none of us, fiction and reality, warning and promise all at once. He reminds us that every child matters, every death leaves a void, every wound requires tending. He teaches us that monsters aren't born, they're made, through neglect and abandonment and the casual cruelty of a world that has forgotten how to grieve. But he also offers hope, though it's buried beneath layers of horror and tragedy. If monsters are made, they can potentially be unmade. If trauma creates Jason, healing can transform him back into the child he was meant to be. The hockey mask can come off, the weapons can be set aside, the cycle of violence can be broken. All it requires is someone brave enough to see the wounded child beneath the monster's exterior, someone willing to offer love without conditions, someone ready to sit with pain until it transforms into something else. Not revenge, not rage, not the need to make others suffer as we have suffered, but wisdom, compassion, and the fierce determination to protect other children from sharing Jason's fate. In the end, Jason Vorhees isn't the villain of his own story, he's the victim, the symptom, the canary in the coal mine warning us about what happens when we fail to care for our most vulnerable members. The real villains are indifference, neglect, the systems and attitudes that create Jasons in the first place. So the next time you see that hockey mask, don't just think about horror movies or slasher films. Think about the child it represents, the pain it conceals, the community that failed him. Think about your own masks, your own buried wounds, your own potential for both destruction and healing. And remember, monsters aren't the opposite of human. They're what we become when our humanity is damaged beyond recognition, but not beyond redemption. Jason's story isn't over as long as we keep telling it, keep learning from it, keep using it to become better at protecting the children who are depending on us not to create any more monsters. The lake is still there, reflecting sky and trees and the endless possibility of what could be. The choice of what story gets written next is ours.